visual effects, and frankly, one suspects future blockbusters. So just invite me to the Academy Awards ceremony. Professor Radke recently was named to the Prism magazine 20 Under 40 list of the most imaginative engineering faculty in North America. Prism, which is published for the American Society for Engineering Education, cited his much praised teaching as well as his fascinating research. And indeed, we honor Professor Radke today, and I'm giving away a little bit, with a 2014 School of Engineering Classroom in Excellence Award. And so it is my very great pleasure to welcome and to introduce to you Professor Richard Radke.
Thank you very much. Okay, so thanks very much. So looking out at this crowd, I see lots of familiar faces. This is like giving a talk to a bunch of friends. This just shouldn't be that hard. So as Professor Jackson said, my research is in computer vision, and what I hope to tell you about today is kind of what is computer vision, where are you most likely to encounter it in your daily life, what kind of computer vision research is going on here at RPI, in my lab, and other places, and then how does that tie into what Professor Jackson mentioned about my visual effects research in the book that I wrote. Okay, so first off, what is computer vision? So very briefly put, it's trying to train computer algorithms that can look at an image and understand it in the same way that a person does. Not just an image, maybe also a still movie or a video. And so, for example, a human can look at these two pieces of an airport and say, okay, the guy outlined in blue is the same guy as the guy outlined in red. We'd like to be able to train a computer how to do that so that we don't have to have somebody sitting in front of this bank of monitors all day trying to pick out matching people. In the same way, lots of people in hospitals and clinics are time-consumingly drawing outlines around organs of interest in things like CAT scans. And so, again, this is very tedious but important in order to deliver, for example, radiation therapy. And it takes an expert to be able to understand, okay, this gray splotch over here is the prostate, and it's different from that gray splotch over there, which is the bladder, right? And so automatically designing an algorithm to solve that problem would also be very useful and save lots of kind of tedious human effort. And even more advanced material, so this is not all work that's going on at RPI. The top two are my work, and the bottom two, so at bottom left is some work that just came out of Princeton where you go into your hotel room and you point your smartphone at it, and the smartphone automatically says, okay, that's the bed, that's the night table, that's the dresser, right? So automatically understanding objects from images, no matter what the lighting condition or clutter in the room, is a computer vision problem. Or, you know, looking at a natural image that you take a picture of or pull off the web and automatically parsing that into a description of what's going on, which is, again, an increasingly interesting but very difficult problem in computer vision. This is research that just came out of Stanford. So you take this image and it turns into a text description that says man in black shirt playing guitar, right? That's very cutting-edge computer vision research. Okay, so why are these problems difficult? Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you a quick image, and then we'll talk about it. Okay, so that was a small image. It flashed on the screen very briefly. So what kind of environment was that image taken in? Outdoors? In this room? Indoors? What kind of indoors? A lobby? Okay. And then were there any people in that image? Okay, and about how many people were there in that image? 8, 15, 7, 20, okay, 4. What was the context of what was happening in that image? Scale, okay. Playing a trick, okay. So let's take a look at that image again, right? So you guys only saw this image at a distance for about half a second, and people picked out a lot of stuff immediately about that image, right? And so some of those things are kind of reaching what computers can do today, and some of those are very far out of the reach of computers. So for example, where is the image taken, right? So there are cues that your human visual system kind of naturally picks up on, things like straight lines and vanishing points that kind of cue you into the fact this is a man-made environment, it's probably indoors. And so this is what makes it look different than an outdoor environment. And so if you had another couple minutes to look at it, you'd certainly see it was a locker room of some sort. Maybe you'd pick that out from things like these tiles here, right? How many people are in the image? So we can count about 5 people, right? And so if you looked at this image for more than a second, you would certainly be able to tell that, these reflections of people are not real people, right? So counting the people in the image is probably something that we could do today with algorithms. But understanding that these mirror images are not like portals to other rooms where there were other people that happened to be in these positions, that would be, I think, a very tricky thing for a vision algorithm to understand right now. Okay, so there was talk of a scale, right? So the scale basically, if you think about it, the scale doesn't really take up that much space in the image. It's the same color as the wall, and it's really only separated from the wall by this, dark stripe. So to kind of cue in that that's a scale, a physical object, is a pretty tricky problem. That's, I think, a much harder problem than being able to distinguish that it's a cat or a dog or a bicycle. So there was talk about playing a trick, right? So not only is there a scale, there's this guy's foot on the scale, right? And again, the shoe is black, the other guy's shoes are black, the platform of the scale is black. To be able to distinguish that this is something that's happening and to understand why that's kind of interesting or funny, that's, again, a very, very hard problem. So why do we know that someone is playing a trick, right? So we can infer some things about, for example, this guy is looking downwards, right? So you could do something about gaze angle. Why is this, what is the person looking at? And then you see people who are kind of smiling, right? That kind of cues you in that something is funny about this. And maybe the thing that's funniest of all is that it's the president who is pushing down on the scale, right? And so all these things are happening in your brain and in your mind very, very quickly to form an assessment of what's happening. I think that, there are some things like face recognition that we'll talk about in just a second that an algorithm could do automatically right now. And there are some things like understanding why this is a funny picture that I think we are many, many years away from. Okay. So I talked a little bit about face detection. And so that's one thing that you're definitely likely to come across in your real-world experience. So most digital cameras these days have a face detection function that will make little boxes around the faces. And even more advanced cameras now have blink detection. So they may be able to tell if someone in their camera, someone in the image has their eyes closed, or smile detection to tell if everyone is looking nice in the image. And it may even wait between the time that you press the shutter button and the time it actually takes the picture to wait for everyone's eyes to be open and for people to be smiling and straight ahead, right? So that's definitely getting built into your digital cameras now. And in the future, you may have something like at the lower right where the camera is predicting the behavior of what may happen to the subject. So for example, if you're not facing right at the camera right now, maybe based on the motion of your head over the past half a second, it can tell when you're likely to face the camera and then snap the picture then. If you have a smartphone, you can download basically Amazon's app. There's something called Amazon Flow, and this is really cool. So basically, you just point your smartphone at a product, and literally in under a second, it will bounce back at you with the name of the product and a link for you to buy it on Amazon, right? So Amazon is very interested in computer vision technology because they want to sell you products, obviously. And so this works on everything from books, which is the original market, to things like here I took some pictures of Ziploc bags and sea salt and a Cliff Bar and so on. And so you might say, well, maybe it's doing it with text recognition, right? And that may be part of it, but then I've got something like at this upper right that's just a notebook with a cassette tape on it that automatically recognizes that this is a Moleskine designer notebook, right? So there's automatic feature detection going on, which is something I'll talk about in a few slides. And then, it's doing all that computer vision partially maybe on your phone, partially maybe up in the cloud, and then sending you a link, and all that happens in a fraction of a second, right? And more generally, things that you can do on your smartphones. So in my PhD, I did research in stitching images together to make a panorama. So you go on vacation, you take pictures with your phone, or it used to be you take pictures with your camera, right? And later on, you come back to your computer and you want to make one big mosaic picture, right? These days, again, your digital camera probably has a function to help you do that process. And even your phone will do it. There's an app called Photosynth that as you move your phone, it will kind of incrementally build up the mosaic, and it's ready to go immediately. Similarly, you can take a picture and say, okay, there was some, crud on this soccer field, that I don't like. And all you have to do is swipe your finger over the stuff that you don't want, and it will automatically fill in texture that looks realistic and gets rid of the unwanted objects, right? We're talking about that a little bit in the Hollywood part. This is I think it's called Fix. There's one called Twixt and one called Fix. Then at the lower right, you can even do things like very simple 3D reconstruction. So as you move your phone around an object, and it tells you kind of move it up, move it down, move it all around, it will build up a little kind of 3D version of the object that you can move around. And even more advanced, you can upload that to the cloud and order it, and you'll have it the next day as a 3D printed object, right? So these things would have been kind of unthinkable maybe 10 years ago, but now they're running on commodity hardware like phones. In the future, we can expect to see even more advanced techniques that are built on range sensing. So maybe some of you or maybe some of your kids have the Microsoft Kinect, which is basically a infrared camera that projects a pattern of light into the scene and allows you to automatically infer the distances in meters of points to the scene. And that's what they use to control, dance avatars and stuff like that. So the new Google phone, Google Tango, is going to have cameras and depth sensors that as you move through an environment, it's automatically 3D mapping the environment for you. And that you can do things like augmented reality and path planning and very, very interesting applications are enabled by that. And on a smaller scale, the Amazon Kindle or the Amazon Fire phone, which nobody bought, was innovative in the sense that it had these cameras on the front that as you moved your head around the lock screen, it would detect your head and detect where you were looking, and you would be like looking through this portal in your hand to a kind of a moving environment. That was really slick. So even though the phone didn't sell, I think you're going to see similar technologies like that coming to bear. You probably heard about self-driving cars, right? So things like the Google car use an array of cameras mounted on the car as well as a 3D sensor on the roof of the car that's sending out laser pulses out into the world and bouncing information back. And so that's becoming a reality maybe in places like California. I'll believe the hype when it starts to drive around Albany in December. But this is something, again, it's a triumph of real-time processing of both 3D and visual information. And we're going to talk a little bit about this kind of 3D sensing later on in the context of what we do at RPI. Okay, so now I want to talk a little bit about what's happening at RPI, right? So shortly after MPAC was built, I was really excited about the potential of using these huge studios to do kind of human-scale simulation. And so I put together a full-scale simulation of a security screening checkpoint. So I figured out where to buy the gray bins that you put your stuff in. We built a fake conveyor belt, or I guess it was a real conveyor belt, but a fake X-ray machine. We had boarding passes, and we had a fake metal detector, and we brought in groups of people to run through this simulation as if it was a real airport. So doing exactly what you do normally, take off your shoes, put your laptop in the bin, and that kind of thing. And the goal was to see if we could automatically track all the people in the environment and associate bags on the conveyor belt with the people. And so this may be important, for example, if somebody takes your laptop at the other end of the belt, you want to know that, hey, that thing doesn't belong to that person. And so that resulted in a bunch of computer vision problems. One was, since we had a bunch of separate cameras in the ceiling, how do you automatically stitch those cameras together into a mosaic? And since the cameras have different colors and different distortions, you have to kind of squeeze them together in the right way. This is kind of similar to that photosynth problem. And then we had to develop tracking algorithms, and this is kind of the result of that, whereas people kind of come up to the belt, they get a white square that says this is a new person, and then every bag that they put on the belt gets a yellow square with a little number that says what number bag is this and who does it belong to, right? And so this was something that actually ended up working pretty well, and it led to an actual collaboration at an airport. So this is an example of the simulation making it sufficiently accurate that it would be something that people would actually see the benefit of. And now I have this huge collaboration with the Cleveland airport where we're doing things like detecting people going the wrong way through exit lanes, because if you do that and you're not caught, then they may have to actually dump the entire terminal at a cost of millions of dollars. This is a specific problem called re-identification. And so the idea here is that for some reason, the TSA has picked you out as a bad person, and so they want to follow you around as you go through the cameras in the airport. And so here's an example where in the first camera, the upper left, we find this woman and we draw a box around her, and now we try and find her again in these other cameras. Now, she could go either to concourse B or to concourse C, and as soon as we tag her, then the system starts to chug a little bit, tracking all the other people who are appearing in the other cameras, looking for good matches. And this is a tricky problem because the appearance of the person may not look the same in one camera to the other. And in fact, so far this woman is just kind of wandering around camera A. She's going to come back into frame in just a second, look at this kiosk, and at some point she makes the decision, okay, I need to go to concourse C. And so then she walks off to the side, and you can see her kind of coming up from concourse C here. And then she bubbles up to the top as being the top recognized candidate, even though here we're seeing her from the front, and in the kind of tag image we saw her from the back. And so this is something that we're trying to get in real time, and it's a really challenging problem. It's not only an academic research problem of kind of how do you extract features from these, kind of cruddy blocks of pixels, but then how do you make it work in a way that the, DHS officers can actually see it working in real time. So that's a project that's underway right now. Another computer vision project I'm involved with is in the Smart Lighting Engineering Research Center, at Smart Lighting ERC here at RPI. And it takes place in this new room that we built on campus called the Smart Conference Room. This is over in the CII on the 8th floor and 7th floor. And you can certainly come and take a look at it. Basically, it's got these very advanced color-tunable lights in the ceiling. They can display not only white light, but RGB and amber light and mix them together in ways that make the environment conducive to things like studying or sleeping and so on. Hopefully not sleeping too much in the conference room. And these black panels that you can see in the ceiling are time-of-flight systems, which basically mean they're like distance rangers, not that different from the Microsoft Kinect, but super, super low res. And the goal here is to be able to take the output of this array of sensors and automatically track the people in the room. Since the sensor output is really very, very low resolution, very cruddy, we don't have any sort of privacy concerns about, who is this person, what are they doing something illicit? I mean, all it looks like are gray blobs moving around the room. But the idea is that we can very accurately track, dozens of people moving through the space, and we can be able to automatically decide, for example, are these people, having a conference? Are they watching a movie? Are they, looking out the window? Are they working hard on something? And so this is work that we're working on right now, and we'll certainly have some exciting demos to show when the NSF comes back to review the center in June. My student Dan Cruz in collaboration with John Wen. And so here again, we're using image and distance sensing to allow Dan to control this robot, this industrial robot, in real time just with his gestures, right? And so this robot is very, heavy and very dangerous in some sense. I mean, so it may be something like an industrial robot that you can't get into that environment and use directly. You have to direct it instead of using a joystick or something. Here you can actually control it with your gestures. And so there's computer vision problems here in both turning the image and the depth image of Dan into the skeleton and then telling the robot how to do it. And also you can see on the side of the tub there are some markers that tell the robot how to pick up the tub. And so there are some cameras that are mounted on these silver things on the robot's wrists that are looking at the tub, understanding when it's time to push in and grab it. So I'm not the only one doing computer vision research at RPI. So for example, Chong Ji, our ECSC department, does a lot of work with face detection, face tracking, emotional recognition, and so on. So one of his projects involved mounting cameras inside cars so that you could, for example, tell if the driver was fatigued. Because obviously if someone starts to nod off to sleep, you definitely want the car to alert them and to say, hey, this is a problem, right? So Chong is an expert in that. And Chuck Stewart in our computer science department recently has this big project in Africa where you are automatically identifying animals. And so you take a picture out of your safari van to take a picture of zebras, and then your phone picks up and tells you, these are the names of the zebras and the lineage of the zebras. And apparently these zebras have Facebook friends. I'm not sure why that's true. But basically, the idea is that you can use these not only to identify what's going on, but also to determine how are the animals using the land. How are their patterns affected by changes that the humans make to their environment? And it not only works on zebras, it works on all sorts of animals. And so Chuck's lab is doing some really exciting stuff. And I'm kind of envious that he gets to go to Kenya and work on this kind of thing, and I get to go to Cleveland at the airport. So, okay. Not to slam on Cleveland, but could be better. Okay. And so now I want to transition to, the visual effects part, right? The Hollywood part. And so around, I guess I would say maybe 2007, shortly after I did that thing in MPAC, I started to get excited about the relationship between computer vision and movie making. Because it turns out that you can motivate a lot of kind of core computer vision ideas with things that are happening in the movies. And so I had a friend in grad school who was a computer graphics guy. He always talked about going to this conference, super cool, all the movie studios come and they show footage in progress. This is called SIGGRAPH. And I was really envious. It's like, man, my research is not that cool, right? But one of the advantages of being a professor is that you can really find your way to things that are maybe not right in your wheelhouse, but allow you to develop some new ideas. And so when MPAC was built, I used that kind of as the impetus to offer a course on computer vision. At the time, it was called Computer Vision and Graphics for Digital Arts. And at the time, I was teaching it out of this thick stack of copied papers from conferences and journals. And it was a lot of fun. We had both engineers, computer scientists, and people from our EMAC department, for example. So it was a real mix of people from different backgrounds where we talked about these papers. But it was a little bit unsatisfying because you had to have this big binder of stuff that came from the bookstore every semester. And so instead, I decided to write my own book on the topic. And so that's what this is. So I took a sabbatical in 2010, 2011, and basically spent, 12, 15 months up in my upstairs office spreading out papers and figuring out how to kind of put all these ideas together into a way that made sense to me as an engineer with kind of consistent notation and cool pictures from movies and so on. And that's what I want to talk about a little bit today. So the next part of the talk is basically what are some of the kinds of problems that are related to computer vision that happen in the context of TV and movie making. And so, again, I should emphasize that, the Rensselaer part is kind of over in the sense that it's not like I'm directly impacting what's going on in Hollywood, but there are some cases where there's lots of academic research that has percolated its way into the tools that visual effects artists currently use. Okay, so one of the key problems that visual effects artists face is called matting. And so this is a familiar kind of problem. So if you've seen any sort of behind-the-scenes DVD, you see lots of blue screens, lots of green screens, right? And so the problem is you want to take out the foreground and put that foreground on some new fantastical background, right? And so this example you might think is not so bad because, you know, clearly the background that you don't want is blue and the foreground that you want is this black color. So maybe it's not so hard to take the outline of this guy in the background and find the sharp edge of his black coat against the blue background. And you're right, that's not such a hard problem. What makes it challenging is, for example, this guy in the foreground who's got a kind of a fuzzy body due to the depth of field. In that case, those pixels are kind of a mixture of the foreground color and the background color. And so not only do you have to tell where the boundary is, you also have to tell what is the fraction of mixture that you have between foreground and background at every point. So for those of you that are graphics people, that's the alpha channel. So it's a little bit tricky because you don't know what the actual foreground color is and you don't know what the transparency is. So even in cases like this, so when I was at, I did a couple of trips to Los Angeles to kind of learn about visual effects. And at the time, one of the companies was working on the first of the new Muppet movies. And so if you look at the footage for that, it's all basically guys in these blue beekeeper suits, you know, pushing Muppets around on blue sticks. And so here, again, you have a problem of, even though the Muppet body is relatively well segmented from the blue guys, you know, his arm there is undergoing some motion, and that motion blur has the same sort of effect of having to disambiguate what is the foreground and what is the background. Here's an example from the movie called Source Code. And so again, here, this wispy hair of this woman that's kind of flying off, that's going to be really difficult to, you can't outline that manually pixel by pixel. You have to figure out some way to automatically estimate the fuzziness of this woman's head. And it's complicated by the fact that she's also got the kind of backlighting. And so the pixels there are a combination of her hair color, the green screen, and the lighting color. So there's more going on there. So certainly, you know, you expect blue screen to be all over the place in, you know, movies like Star Wars, right? But in fact, there's lots and lots of blue screen in places that you might not expect. And so, for example, this is a still from a David Fincher movie, a long ago one called Zodiac, right? So here you got two detectives, and one guy has said, okay, go point at that X, and that turns into a scene like this, right? So you probably would look at this scene and not know that any sort of digital manipulation had been done, when in fact these guys are just standing on a blue screen pointing at an X. And so here's an example of shots from TV shows that illustrate how kind of pervasive this is, including the kinds of TV shows that you might not expect. So here's a scene from Grey's Anatomy, for example. So I used to think, you know, when I was a kid and we were watching shows like ER, and there would be this one special episode where it was clear that they took the actors to Chicago and filmed them on the streets of Chicago. They don't do that anymore. So basically now they have what's called the digital backlot, which means that they film actors in a parking lot somewhere, and then they composite in the city that they want to be in later on. So there's a whole high-resolution digital version of Washington, D.C., or New York City, or Chicago. I like this one a lot, actually. These guys jogging around. It's actually just jogging around this green screen, right? So, I mean, and one of the reasons for that is cost, right? Because it's very expensive to go to a city and block off streets and get permits, and all the passersby are looking at the actors, right? So now they can just film it in the privacy of their parking lot and drop people in later. Next time you watch TV, you should kind of keep an eye out for possible blue screen shots. I think it's not an exaggeration to say that every time you see a shot that's outside, especially with other people in the background, there's a good chance that it was actually just composited in later. Here's an example from Ugly Betty, actually, that I like a lot. So there's really nothing here, not even the bus stop or the UPS guy, right? It's just a blue screen, or it's just a green screen with, you know, so they must have gone out on the street, filmed this footage. No one would care because there's no Hollywood actors in the scene, right? So again, this kind of thing is pretty crazy to imagine this is happening under your nose all the time. However, you can't always just throw up a blue screen or a green screen behind somebody for reasons of cost or the size of the thing that would have to happen. Or even just in this case, this is a still from a Clint Eastwood film called Flags of Our Fathers. So Clint Eastwood felt very strongly that he didn't want these blue screens and green screens in these environments because he thought it would kind of detract from immersion of the actors in the scene. And so instead, they filmed actors in real environments and then composited in the background later on. And so this is a much harder problem to solve automatically because the foreground of the scene, the real scene, these, you know, grays and browns of these rocks is pretty much the same grays and browns of the background, right? And so somewhere in a dimly lit room was a bunch of visual effects artists drawing the boundary and estimating the alpha values between every, you know, pixel in the foreground and every pixel in the background. And so even though these are problems that computer vision can help with, for example, a vision person would call this a natural image matting problem. You may be able to solve that nowadays in Photoshop with some, super manual intervention. But again, these visual effects artists have to solve these problems at, very large images, very, 30 frames a second video so that it all looks good. And so unfortunately, this is a place where, while I think vision could help, we have a long way to go towards really making tools that artists can use. Okay, so once you've kind of peeled off all the foreground layers that you want to use, the next problem is kind of assembling them back together into an image that you want to show the audience, right? And so that problem is called image compositing. And often before you do compositing, there's also some steps of editing, right? So here's an example where you've got these actors who are hanging from wires, and you want to remove the wires and just put them in as if they're floating in midair, right? And so here's a problem that's maybe not so hard, because the places where the wires cross the background are generally kind of constant color, right? So the line that goes across this fluorescent light, you can imagine just filling in from the sides of that line some white pixels, and maybe it would look okay. Although if you do it badly, it may look great for one frame, but then you may find that over the course of playing the video, it looks kind of wobbly and weird. They used to call that the glass rod effect, as if you were waving a glass rod in front of the screen. So this is a problem that you'd call in-painting, I guess. So removing things like wires and gantries that you don't want. A tougher problem is when you've got something like this stoplight in the middle of Deadwood that you have to get rid of, right? And so in that case, someone has to kind of either paint what happened behind that stoplight, or they have to look at other images of the scene where the stoplight doesn't appear and somehow warp or steal pixels to put them there the right way. Again, this can be a very tedious and manual process. Or you may be in the situation that's kind of like the reverse green screen. So here you've got the real scene, but you've got guys in green pajamas who you want to remove, fill in the background, and then replace them with, other digital actors, right? So again, this tends to be very time-consuming and burdensome. Then you've got problems of kind of splicing images together. And so this is still from a movie called Moon, which featured multiple versions of Sam Rockwell playing against himself. And so he wasn't on a blue screen or a green screen in these shots. He basically acted the same activity from two different angles, and they put that together. So it used to be, if you're watching a show like Friends that had twins, it used to be that the seam between the two twins was actually pretty obvious. Like there'd be a big post in the middle of the cafe, and they would be on different sides of the post, right? These days, it's really imperceptible about where the artists are able to hide the seam. Maybe it goes through these kind of constant color regions where you wouldn't notice the difference. Maybe it goes through the edges. Again, that's a really tough artistic call to make, and there are some tools that are starting to help make that splice the best visual splice that you can make. And then that kind of generalizes to cases where you're compositing in lots of things into the same scene. I mean, any given scene for a movie probably contains tens to hundreds of different layers, right? So some of these Harry Potters may have been in the actual environment. Some of them may have been on a blue screen and put in later. It's really hard to know. So here's an example of a really tough compositing problem. So this is a music video with Kylie Minogue where there are multiple copies of her moving around, right? And so basically she went around this circular camera filming 4 or 5 times, and then some visual effects artists had to figure out, okay, so which version of Kylie goes in front of which other version of Kylie. There's lots of really complex interaction between all of these, copies, right? So this is a really tough compositing problem. Here's, again, kind of like a removal and replacement kind of problem. I like this because of the barbecue tongs that tug on the dog's ear. And here's one where this is a case where there's this, blue stick that they're pushing around this guy's head, and it's like a blue baseball bat that they mush up against his face to see how his face and his glasses are going to deform, and then they have to figure out how do we replace all the stuff where that blue stick was, right? They have to hallucinate what happened to his hair, what happened to his skin, and then they can put back in the alien on top of that, right? So again, this is a complex kind of image compositing and image analysis problem. Okay, so another thing you're likely to see if you watch a lot of behind-the-scenes DVD stuff, not only do they have the blue screen, but they have like little masking tape crosses on the back of the blue screen. And those are used to help the effects artists know how the camera was moving around the scene. And so you'll see things like this, where you've got these, blue environments with a little bit of stuff on the background to give it some sort of texture, right? And the reason they do that is that by watching how these markers move, they can estimate how the camera moved, and then they can put in other, three-dimensional objects that move in the same way that the camera did, right? So there's a transition point between the guy who is running across the blue screen, and then he falls onto this kind of mat, and then the digital double starts to fly away on this light cycle, right? So it's the motion of these markers on the wall that helps us solve those kinds of problems. And so you could also have markers that are not on the wall, but are actually like little LEDs distributed around the environment. So in this case, there are these little red lights that you can see on the walls and on the floor, and maybe even sometimes on the actors. You may do it on a horse. So for example, this is from Clash of the Titans, where these motion markers on the side of the horse were used to put in the wings of the Pegasus later on. Or from the movie Black Swan, right, where the wings start to grow on Natalie Portman. They have these motion markers on her shoulders that tell the animators this is where things have to go, and they can observe how her body moves. Anything like Terminator, where you've got someone's head that is blown away and you want to replace half of it, again, that all comes from the same kind of dots on someone's face. Now, in real-world situations, you may not have the opportunity to actually go through and put dots on things. You may have to deal with just the real environment. So, for example, if I've got a helicopter shot over this, this yacht area, and I want to put more yachts and more people in the stands, I can't go and start sticking stuff to the ground. I have to find natural features that are good for tracking how the camera moves, right? And so in this case, I may look for things like the corner of that bus, or the red and white checkers on that parking lot, or the tip of the yacht in the water. Again, if I can find those features and track how they move, then I can figure out how the camera moved, and I can start to put stuff in that looks like it belongs and sticks to the scene. And that's a critical thing for any movie or TV show where you've got digital actors that are playing against the real actors. So movies like Transformers, or movies like Gerbil, G-Force and stuff like that. Anywhere where you've got a moving shot that you want to compose some sort of effect into, you have to do this sort of camera tracking problem. And that leads to what's called match moving, which is once you know how the camera moves, then you can take your original footage and you can start to insert three-dimensional elements that seem to move exactly as the camera was moving. So I can make spaceships appear to kind of hover in the space in a very 3D accurate way, right? And so this is a place where actually computer vision as an academic discipline can claim to have made some impact, because it used to be that you had to solve these kinds of problems very tediously by hand, by figuring out how big the spaceship should be and where it should be. That was a huge pain. It could look very badly. It could look very bad if you did it wrong. Now there are automatic software tools that really came out of research that started at the University of Oxford that, again, that's an example of a professor and his research group who developed an algorithm, made it really robust, commercialized it. Now it's used every day in visual effects studios. Here's an example, again, of more like footage that you might take with your cell phone or your camera, for example. This kind of shows how convincing it can be. So this is, compositing a car into this parking lot. And after you're done, after you've compensated for things like lighting and shadows, the car in the front looks pretty much the same as the car that's behind it, right? And so it's pretty striking to imagine that, again, whenever you watch a movie and you see cars on the road, most of those cars are not actually in the scene. Just like when you see a car commercial and the helicopter is flying around, you see the car taking these curves, that's not actually a car there either. That's all composited after the fact. And a kind of more mundane way of using these kinds of effects is kind of, sometimes there are movies or TV shows that kind of make credits or text appear like they're floating in the air as the camera moves around. So like if you ever watched the TV show Fringe, this used to happen a lot, where they have these credits that kind of you push through with the camera. And so, again, this is a case of tracking the camera and then tying these objects to the motion of the camera. And actually, another example of that is in something like, movie credits like this, where the actors' names seem to kind of stick to the ground in a realistic way. And again, this is not a really flashy visual effect, but it's the same kind of principle of feature tracking, match moving, and inserting digital objects. And this is also used for things like set extensions. So this is a still from the movie A Beautiful Mind, which was filmed in Princeton. So again, I remember when Russell Crowe was there, everyone was excited, but it turns out that many of the scenes were more like this, where Russell Crowe is on a stage somewhere, and they took some reference photography of Princeton, and they figured out by moving the camera around, well, how should we build the rest of this digital Princeton? We can talk about that a little bit in the last part of the talk. So motion capture probably people are also kind of generally familiar with. So this is the guy in the pajamas with the little marker balls, right? And so this is, again, something that really, I think, I don't know if I can claim that it came out of academic research, but certainly academic researchers are very interested in motion capture. We actually have different kinds of motion capture labs on campus. Brett Fajan in our cognitive science department has one, and Agung Julius in our ECSE department has another one. And so basically, this is how you can take the motions of a real person and map them onto a digital character. And so, for example, a movie like Avatar really catapulted this into further consciousness, because almost all of Avatar was filmed in a motion capture stage in an airport hangar somewhere in California. So, I just want to make a mention that it's not as easy as the media makes it sound, in the sense that it's not like, the actor will perform this motion and suddenly it becomes mapped onto this digital character immediately. It's actually maybe 80% or 90% that, but not all the way. And so one of the reasons for that is that, these humans are 6 feet tall, and they were being mapped onto these, aliens that were 9 feet tall, right? So the bodies of the performers are not really mapping directly one-to-one onto the bodies of the digital characters. So if you're doing, a gnome or a giant or ape, those kinds of bodies are not like human bodies. And also, especially around the face, like the facial animation, it's very difficult to take the image or the tracked markers on an actor's face and just kind of stick that right onto a digital actor and not do any more modification. There's an army of visual effects artists slaving away in dim rooms trying to make that look really realistic for you. Here's an example from Pirates of the Caribbean. They kind of figured out at some point how to dispense with needing to be in the aircraft hangar and take these, mocap suits out into the wild. Here, the actor is wearing kind of a combination of some of these markers, but also this kind of paper band around his head and some markers on his face. And again, by observing this scene from multiple perspectives, you can figure out the 3D positions of these markers and start to use that to help animate your digital character. So for a movie like Tron Legacy, here, this was a movie where Jeff be 20 or 30 years younger than he used to be, right? So they had a digital version of Jeff Bridges, and in order to do that, they took they made him wear this kind of helmet that has these carbon fiber rods on it with 4 cameras pointing at his face, and they stenciled these dots finely over the surface of his face. And then basically by looking at the output of those cameras, they could make the digital version of his head map onto the body of this younger actor who is actually performing the actions in the scene. So basically the younger actor does the whole, body part, and Jeff Bridges comes on and does his part in sweatpants, and then they use this camera stuff to put his head back together onto the object. These days, this is from the Avengers. Here, this guy has got lots of things. He's got the gray pajamas, he's got the black and white circles, he's got dots on his face, and he's got motion capture markers on his head, right? So these days, people are using all sorts of techniques simultaneously to be able to do this kind of more general performance capture. And they even do this for horses, right? So this is, I think, again, from Avatar, where you can see, I don't think we could do this in our motion capture lab for various reasons, but, if you've got a very large motion capture lab, you could capture how animals move. That would be very interesting. So the final thing I want to talk about is 3D data acquisition. So I kind of mentioned that we want to build things like digital buildings and digital actors. How does that work? And this is maybe the closest thing to stuff that we've been doing on campus. And so with Chuck Stewart several years ago, we got some money to develop 3D sensing and image processing technologies. And so we bought ourselves a laser range finding scanner called a LiDAR scanner. And so this basically sits on top of a tripod. It spins around and it sends laser pulses out into the world and measures the time it takes for those pulses to come back to the sensor. And using that, we can make very detailed digital models. And so we went around scanning all the buildings on campus. And so we have some very nice scans of MPAC, and we have tons of scans of the VCC because it's a very pretty building. And so this is an example of one of our algorithms that's taking the shadow that's left behind from this tree, which basically made an obstruction on the building, and kind of hallucinating what should be behind that tree on that building by stealing parts of the other scene. And so this is kind of like a 3D version of that filling in problem I told you about. And so it's very common for you go to a movie set and they immediately use a laser scanner to capture all the 3D geometry of the sets. And so for Thor, when they filmed the first Thor, they actually built this whole 4-block square town in the middle of New Mexico where they filmed all the action. And then you can see here, these circles here are basically the centers of where the laser scanner was. And so they scanned all these buildings at very high resolution, and then they could use those to say, okay, suppose we want to destroy this pharmacy with a huge bolt of fire, right? So now they know what the shape of it is, and they can assign material properties to it, and they can kind of cross-fade between the actual footage and the digital version that you can destroy. You film not only sets with 3D scanning, but also things like cars. And so here's an example of a car from Fast 5. One issue with things like this is that really shiny objects, unfortunately, are not very easy to scan. And so maybe the car company delivers their 2016 concept car model, and the first thing the visual effects guys will do is spray it with some white matte paint or kick up some dirt on it to give it enough texture to be able to scan it properly. So there's always a tension between the people in the production and the visual effects guys who want to make their job easier. So certainly you'll scan things like cars, props. You may recall this helmet from Avengers, and also people. So whenever an actor is in costume on a set, they'll put them on this person scanning device that basically shines stripes of light, laser stripes, onto their body. And you can kind of see here basically these yellow laser stripe scanners move up and down the body and build a very accurate three-dimensional model of whatever the actor looked like on that day. So this is certainly good for things like costume reference and film reference, but also, again, once you want to make a digital double of a person that you can replace the actor with, this is very useful. And so certainly there are cases where actors, for liability reasons, can't do certain stunts or can't undertake certain activities, or cases where you've got, many actors who look all the same. So all the Neos, or the Neo who's fighting all the Agent Smiths in the Matrix, right? They had to scan Agent Smith and make a zillion digital copies of him to make Neo fight him. But these scans are actually fairly detailed. You can actually see the wrinkles on this man's face, very detailed. It doesn't do so well with hair, but for facial and clothing stuff, it's very good. Here's another example from Thor. This guy has these kind of, markings on his face that they wanted to make sure they captured once they had made him up properly so they would know how to make the digital double look the same. Okay, so in conclusion, hopefully you've been convinced that computer vision is a cool thing to do, and so it's very satisfying to be able to take an algorithm that you developed in your lab, kind of in an environment with students and computers, kind of bring that into the real world, where you kind of give it the stress testing of a real world application where people actually care about it. If you do that really well, then maybe that gets commercialized into a product that lots and lots of people buy. And if you're lucky, you may see it get made into a movie someday. So, and also it's nice because you can explain to your parents what it is you do, as opposed to some of you who I'm sure have that problem. So that's about it. So thank you very much, and I'll take any questions.
I'll give this to you since I'm up here.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
I'll take that back from you for a moment
Okay.
and answer some questions. Rich, would be open to questions from the audience. Yes, Mark?
How much television do you watch?
Too much television. More than you might expect for a full professor. And unfortunately, I've also spoiled it for family watching at home, because now I'm always watching for bad blue screen, bad green screen, right? So especially driving scenes, you start to watch people driving in cars, you realize how bad that can be. Yep.
Is there how you can use this as predictive ability?
Sure. I mean, a lot of computer vision is about predicting what happens next, right? And so I didn't really talk about it too much here, but for example, that tracking application, you could certainly benefit from guessing how the person is going to move next. And maybe you would learn that from lots of examples of people moving through the concourse. You might know, for example, what's the likelihood that a person moves from the central checkpoint to concourse A versus concourse B versus concourse C, and how long are they likely to dally around the shopping area, right? So there's lots of prediction involved in things like tracking, for example, for sure. Yep. Robert?
So everything you showed was in a very narrow range of the electromagnetic spectrum, visible light.
Yep.
So, and, I know we're talking about vision, and we're talking about vision
Yep.
being in that range, but are there analogs as what one could do, or one would want to do in a different way?
Oh, certainly.
Infrared, I guess.
Right. So a lot of the depth sensing, those things like the Microsoft Connect, that all happens in the infrared. So certainly, and processing those images qualitatively is a lot different than processing visual images, right? You kind of got this grayscale heat map instead of a color map. There's also lots of things like hyperspectral imaging. So for example, if you're doing sensing from satellites that are imaging terrain, there are multiple bands, right? And so instead of having just red, green, blue, now you have a 10-band or a 26-band image, right? And so, all this stuff kind of generalizes to situations where you have multiple bands. But of course, the tools you need to develop differ greatly in terms of kind of qualitatively what these images look like. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yes?
There's a show called Light to Me, in which
Mm-hmm.
you have
Yeah.
analysis of facial features,
Right.
emotions, and all that. How true is
Yeah. The answer to how true is that is probably not very true to any question you could ask. I think that so that's really a case for Chongji, for example. I think that it is true that there have been some advances made in emotion detection. So, for example, you could automatically tell, does this person look happy or sad or disgusted? And this is not my real field, but one thing I would say is that a lot of the data sets that you see people testing those kinds of algorithms on, I find to be very exaggerated. Like if you show someone, if you put someone in front of a camera that's, a foot away from them and say, okay, look happy, right? So they smile, look happy. But that's not really reflective of what happy people really look like, right? I mean, so this kind of capturing genuine emotion, first of all, even acquiring the data to be able to train your algorithm, I think is a much harder problem. So there is some progress, but I wouldn't say it's like the TV show at all. Jim?
Richard, sort of follows up on Robert was asking. So some of the partners we're working with now are doing things with LiDAR, with mixed LiDAR,
Right.
vision, etc.
Right.
The mixed mode stuff.
Yes.
How much harder, simpler, better is
Right.
multi-sensors versus
Generally, it's better. I mean, so for a lot of this LiDAR stuff I showed you with this VCC example, so in that case, one problem with LiDAR, right, is that you just get a distance. So basically, you get this kind of point cloud, and so I've heard a DARPA program manager call it a cloud of angry bees, right? So you just get a bunch of white dots out there in 3D space. If those dots have colors attached to them from a co-registered RGB camera, then processing becomes much easier, right? So in general, I would say that the work that Chuck Stewart and I did for that project really involved joint RGB and depth processing. And I think that you'll find that a lot of the algorithms that are inside things like the Connect and the Tango phone are going to also leverage both the depth and the color. Shakar. Yeah.
Initially, you showed these pictures from Princeton, the person's playing guitar, or this picture.
Right.
And we can immediately tell what's going on.
Yes.
Right? And so what do we understand about how we process information and how much is there an overlap between what computers do?
Right. So I feel like we were just having this conversation at a field exam this morning in a way, because you might try to imagine that to describe guitar, for example, maybe you try and teach the computer what a guitar looks like by saying, okay, it's got a long neck and it's got a round thing and there are strings on it. But I think that in practice, the way that these algorithms are most successful work is simply by labeling a bunch of images that say guitar and throwing them into some machine learning soup and developing some sort of black box classifier that knows what elements make up a guitar, right? And so it's very unlike, I think, the way that a human would solve the problem. But at the same time, it can be extremely effective, right? So those results I showed, the one of the man with the guitar is a project at Stanford, and actually it was just written up in the New York Times, I think, last week. So if you kind of Google computer vision in the New York Times for the most recent article, you'll find some stuff on it, right? But again, all that stuff is like really heavy duty, lots of labeled examples, machine learning kind of stuff. It's not like generative, what is a guitar, what is a man, what is a shirt kind of thing. Yeah. Sure.
All right.
Peter? Oh,
There is
I'm sorry.
question. Yes, Peter, go ahead.
How do computer vision algorithms handle things like inference patterns, moire patterns, and things like that? The humans have trouble determining if they're real or not.
That's an interesting question in some sense. I mean, in a way, that's kind of like a 2D analog of aliasing and sampling and so on, right? And so you might argue that if you have those kinds of patterns in your image, you should have acquired it better, right? But then there are some cases like interference patterns. I imagine things like slit photography for, diffraction patterns, where you actually care about what that pattern looks like. I'm not super sure, other than to say that I'm sure that people have tried to apply automatic image understanding algorithms to what those artifacts look like. But beyond that, those are difficult. I mean, one thing that I should say is that, as soon as you introduce issues like that, noise, reflections from lights, shadows and things like that, all these algorithms become much harder to work with, right? And that's an example of the kind of distortion that you might see in a real image.
Well, if there are no further questions, Rich, thank you once again.
Okay, thanks for listening. All right,
Thank you.
I'll just close my computer up here and then I'll come back to this.
So at this point, I'd like to invite President Jackson and Judge Gayarsa to please join me here on the stage.